If you have ever lived on bread and caffeine and bad decisions, you already know this. A regime does not survive just because it has a constitution, a speech, or a king with excellent tailoring. Sometimes it survives because one very basic question still has a decent answer. This morning, can people afford bread? From 1789 to 1848, France kept replaying a brutal little pattern. First the weather went wrong, then harvests failed, then transport broke down, then bread prices climbed. Then the streets started cursing. Then markets started panicking. Then rumors spread like wildfire. And then, sooner or later, a dynasty, a king, or an emperor discovered that political legitimacy becomes surprisingly fragile when people are hungry and full of rage. To be precise, the French in 1789 were not eating the modern baguette in the way people imagine today, but France being dragged around by the price of bread. That part is absolutely true. Welcome to my channel. This is To the Lighthouse. Today we are talking about a subject that feels very French and also very human. Why was it that from Louis XVI to Louis Philippe, from the French Revolution to the Revolution of 1848, the price of bread could help decide whether kings and emperors got to keep their chairs? Bread, state. The first thing to understand is simple. In late 18th century and early 19th century France, bread was not just one food among many. For a huge number of ordinary people, especially in Paris, it was the core of daily survival. It provided the bulk of calories and a great deal of basic nutrition. So when bread became expensive, people did not experience it as an abstract rise in living costs. They experienced it as a threat to life itself. That changes everything. The moment the staple food of the poor becomes unstable, politics stops being a refined discussion about institutions and becomes a direct confrontation between stomachs and the street. And old regime France was not a society where people calmly trusted the market to sort itself out. Quite the opposite. Many ordinary people assumed the state had a duty to secure grain supplies, restrain prices, and stop hoarding. If officials failed, the crowd often felt morally entitled to step in. That is why grain seizures, attacks on convoys, or raids on bakeries were not always seen by the participants as simple criminal acts. They belonged to what historians call a moral economy. People were not making some neat theoretical critique of capitalism. They were saying something much more blunt. If you cannot protect bread, do not expect us to respect your authority. This is also why French revolutions sound so elevated on the surface. Liberty, equality, the republic, constitutions, elections, sovereignty, the rights of man, all of that mattered. But if you dig down far enough, you very often hit a sack of flour. Ideas mattered, yes. Rousseau mattered, Voltaire mattered, Montesquieu mattered, Sieyès mattered, pamphlets mattered. But the city usually did not explode because everyone had just finished a nice reading group. It exploded because breakfast was becoming a political problem. 1789, by 1788, and 1789, France had run into the nightmare combination: bad weather, damaged harvests. The winter was bitterly cold. Rivers froze. Milling and transport suffered. Bread prices in Paris surged. A 4-pound loaf that had cost around 8 sous rose to 14 sous by January of 1789. For us, that is a statistic. For workers and the poor, that was the sky cracking open. Through the winter and spring, consumers in towns and peasants in the countryside clashed again and again around bakeries, markets, mills, and grain convoys. By July, anxiety over food had fused with the political crisis at Versailles. Many Parisians believed bread shortages and royal troop movements were part of the same threat. Starve us on one side, intimidate us on the other. That is how the language of aristocratic conspiracy spread so fast. And that is why the Bastille was not just a prison. It became a target produced by hunger, fear, weapons, rumor, and political panic all at once. In other words, the most iconic modern revolution in French history did not happen after people were comfortably fed and philosophically fulfilled. It accelerated when the bread situation became unbearable. That is also why the Women's March on Versailles in October cannot be understood only through the lens of constitutional conflict or royal symbolism. Yes, representation mattered. Yes, monarchy mattered. Yes, The future of sovereignty mattered, but what pushed people out of their homes was also much more basic. Their children needed food. This is one of the things I personally love about studying the French Revolution. It is always pretending to be pure philosophy, while constantly being interrupted by the body. Michelet later wrote the people as a dramatic force in history, burning with hunger and passion. Arthur Young, traveling through France, saw a country that looked grand from above but felt tense and strained underneath. The beautiful nouns of revolution often stand on top of brutally ordinary biological facts. First bread, then the people, flour and fire. And 1789 was not even the first time France had lost its mind over bread. In 1775 came the famous Flour War. Grain shortages and price increases triggered a chain of unrest, with hundreds of incidents involving grain seizures and related disturbances in just a matter of weeks. The lesson was already visible. Once bread prices slip out of control, social order suddenly reveals how flimsy it really is. There is a broader human pattern here that rulers keep forgetting. Governments often imagine that crowds are moved primarily by abstract doctrines. In reality, people are more often pushed to the wall by food prices, wages, inequality, and the daily feeling that the system is rigged against them. Only then do larger political languages become electrifying. Bread prices are often the spark. Ideas and slogans make the fire spread. As France entered the 19th century, this pattern did not disappear just because the country had already experienced revolution. The Bourbon Restoration did not make bread gentler. The July Monarchy did not remove hunger from politics. A state can change its flag, change its dynasty, change its official vocabulary, and promise moderation in polished language. But as long as ordinary people still depend on weather, speculation, and fragile supply lines for the most basic part of breakfast, bread remains political dynamite. Literature sensed this early. Victor Hugo, George Sand, and Eugène Sue did not keep turning toward the poor, workers, and the urban margins in the 1840s merely out of compassion. They were responding to a society that looked stable on the surface and dangerous underneath. The state talked about order. The lower classes counted loaves. By that point, any regime was basically sitting on an oven, and literature is useful here because it catches the emotional weather of an age. Hugo would later give France vast moral panoramas of misery, justice, and redemption in works like Les Misérables. George Sand looked hard at social suffering and rural life. Eugène Sue, with The Mysteries of Paris, plunged readers into the hidden city beneath respectable society. Different styles, same pressure system. They all understood that when material survival becomes unstable, society develops a kind of fever. Even emperors. This is where the title of the video stops sounding like a metaphor. The fate of kings and emperors really could hinge on bread. After Napoleon, France still did not escape this structural anxiety. Political authority could be strong, administration could be efficient, police could be frightening, armies could be enormous. But if the relationship between wages and food prices turned bad enough, emperors got nervous too. That is what makes this so ruthless. It ruins one of the most romantic myths about French history. People love to imagine that France is moved mainly by great men, dazzling speeches, brilliant generals, and giant ideas. And yes, those figures matter. Napoleon matters, Lamartine matters, Tocqueville matters, Louis Blanc matters, Proudhon matters, Blanqui matters. But if you zoom in a little, the stage on which these great figures perform is often built, rather awkwardly, out of bread. Louis XVI was not simply removed by the social contract descending from the heavens and smacking him on the head. He was first hollowed out by a hungry society. Later rulers faced the same reality. Sitting on a throne or in a palace, they imagined they were governing a nation. In practice, they were also managing an enormous bread shop. And once the shelves looked empty, all the high-minded language in the world started to wobble. The danger was never just food by itself. When bread prices rose, the chain reaction followed fast. Workers spent more on survival and cut back elsewhere. Demand in other sectors fell. Workshops and factories suffered. Unemployment increased. Urban tension sharpened. So a bread crisis was not merely a food crisis. It was a switch that could trigger wider failures in credit, employment, public order, and political confidence. A 19th century form of systemic risk, except back then the crisis was not buried inside technical financial reports. It was hanging in the doorway of the bakery. 1848. The year that stamped this logic in huge letters was 1848. In the years just before it, Europe was already standing on dangerous ground. Potato blight and poor grain harvests turned the period from 1845 to 1847 into a continent-wide crisis. Food prices surged, real wages fell, living standards collapsed, and then came credit problems, business failures, and severe economic downturn. Across Europe there were hundreds, even thousands, of bread riots and survival-driven protests. France, of course, was not going to sit this one out. France was especially tense because the July monarchy under Louis Philippe looked moderate and stable from the outside, yet discontent underneath kept thickening. Republicans remained angry. Workers, burdened by poverty and inspired by the revolutionary memory of 1789, became increasingly radical. Socialist thought flourished between 1830 and 1848. Saint-Simonian thinkers appeared. Fourier proposed his visions. Blanqui sharpened revolutionary conspiratorial politics. Louis Blanc argued for social reform. Proudhon attacked property. The ideological field was buzzing. But then the bad harvest of 1846 fed directly into economic crisis. Food was scarce and expensive. Businesses failed. Employment worsened. Political scandals damaged the government, so when the February Revolution came, it looked like a conflict about electoral reform and the banquet campaign, which it absolutely was. But underneath it was the same old carbohydrate pressure. This is the deeper point. Rumor can accelerate revolution, but bread can start it. Without prolonged crises in prices and survival, even the most elegant slogans may not be enough to push huge numbers of people into the streets at the same time. Hunger gives politics a body. There is also a detail from 1848 that I find especially revealing. After the revolution, even moderate Republicans such as Lamartine were forced to recognize that a civilized society cannot respond to a man without work and without food by offering only abandonment and death. It must offer work and bread. Strip away all the elegance, and that line condenses modern political legitimacy into one brutally simple demand. You do not have to make me happy, but you do have to stop me from starving. And this is where literature, politics, and philosophy suddenly meet. The 19th century loved grand language about progress, civilization, the nation, and history. Yet the most humiliating truth beneath all of it was this. A state that cannot secure basic subsistence will eventually find that its poetry becomes mockery. Daumier could satirize politicians because politics itself had become ridiculous in the eyes of the hungry. Michelet could turn revolution into epic because social suffering had already turned history into drama. Hugo could speak for the poor because the poor were already forcing themselves into the center of the national story. From 1789 to 1848, French history kept proving something that is a little funny and a little terrifying. States appear to run on armies, taxes, law, institutions, and legitimacy. But in the eyes of many ordinary people, a regime still has to pass one very primitive test. Can it keep the staple food of daily life at a price people can survive? That is why bread in France was never just food. It was a political thermometer, a pressure gauge for monarchy, an emotional instrument for the city. In 1789, bread prices jumped and the streets heated up almost immediately. In 1848, bad harvests, price pressure, unemployment, and political deadlocks stacked on top of one another, and another regime cracked. France kept talking about constitutions, republics, nations, and the people. Underneath, a more ancient question kept echoing. Who is responsible for my next mouthful of carbohydrates? And that is what makes bread so dangerous. Not because it is luxurious, but because it is basic. So basic that once it fails, every high-level narrative drops to the floor. Philosophers can debate popular sovereignty. Poets can praise liberty. Historians can write about national spirit. Lamartine can elevate the revolution. Michelet can narrate the people. Hugo can defend the wretched. George Sand can humanize the poor. All of that matters. But those voices are often heard because, before any of them, a great number of exhausted bodies have already shoved history forward. And honestly, this is one reason I keep coming back to French history. It is theatrical, ideological, dramatic, and full of magnificent words. But every now and then it reminds you, with almost insulting clarity, that civilization is still built on extremely ordinary things: flour, transport, wages, weather, breakfast. Once those go bad, the crown starts shaking. Thanks for watching the video. See you at the next lighthouse.